Well, good morning again, everyone, and welcome to what you and I probably call Easter weekend, all right? Biblically speaking, we should probably refer to it as Passover weekend, but we'll just leave that by the by. Whatever you're doing this weekend, this long weekend, trust you guys have a great time and remembering and, most importantly, celebrating what Jesus has done for us. But today we are looking, this video is for our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. We are up to week 9, journeying through the book of Numbers. This week we'll be reading from chapter 7 through to 22, and we'll also be interjecting a psalm, Psalm 90, which is credited to have been written by Moses. So it's not found in the book of Numbers, it's found in the book of Psalms, which apparently was written by Moses. So that's why we're going to interject Psalm 90 this week as well, but essentially working through the book of Numbers. If you've kind of let your readings go in the last few weeks, because, you know, Leviticus was a bit hard, pick it up this week, okay? We're back into narrative, we're back into a storyline, we're back into what I feel is really easy reading story in these chapters in Numbers, and some really important things are going to happen this week. So I'm going to give you a heads up on some of those and then finish off with 5 things I really want you to pay attention to this week, besides, you know, keeping down your Easter egg intake. Okay, let's go. So we're going through the book of Numbers. It's been, remember, a year now since God's people have left Egypt. God promised Moses at the burning bush that he would not just take them out of Egypt and bring them nowhere. No, he was going to take them out of Egypt and take them into a promised land, the land of Canaan, which is the land that God, of course, promised Abraham way back in the book of Genesis in chapter 12. And Mt Sinai, where they've been for the last year, has been a really important step along the way. God says to them at Mt Sinai, I brought you out of Egypt to bring you to myself. Okay? God's intent was not just to bring them to a promised land. His first port of call was to bring them to the promisor. Okay? God's presence is more important than his provision. And so it was more important for them to come to the promisor before they went into the promised land. And so meeting God at Sinai and hearing him speak for themselves was a really important part of that journey. But Sinai, of course, was only ever meant to be for a brief period. They were never meant to stay at the mountain, all right? They were meant to meet God there and then continue to move on through the book of, into Canaan, which is what we start reading about today in these readings in Numbers. The problem with Canaan, of course, is that in the years from Abraham, it's been occupied by other people. And so after establishing a new covenant, after establishing a new calendar, after establishing new forms of culture, after building a sanctuary, a place to worship, a Levitical priesthood, the tent of meeting, all this type of stuff that we've been reading about in the last few weeks, finally, Moses is now establishing in these chapters an administration suitable for God's people to go and take the promised land that's occupied by other people. So effectively what he's now doing is the focus is on getting God's people to become an army, okay? Not just a community of worshippers, but an army of people. And so what we saw last week in our readings in chapter 2 is the way that they camped around the sanctuary when they were staying overnight somewhere. But now what we start to read is the way that they are to march out. And the language actually here really changes. They're not just walking toward the promised land, all right? They are marching toward the promised land. This is a military exercise. God's people are on the move. And you probably missed this last week. This is just something you can Google if you want to look this up. It's pretty cool. But in chapter 2 that we read last week, where it says they camped north, south, east, and west of the sanctuary, if you read the numbers of how many people were in each of those groups, north, south, east, and west, they're not even. Okay, the east, people in the east, Judah, I think they had the most amount of people. People north and south were fairly even, and then there was less in the west. And so what people surmise is that if you were to have a drone, okay, and you were to go up and see the people camping around the sanctuary in their tribal areas, what you'd actually see is a picture of the cross. What you'd actually see is a picture of the cross with the sanctuary right in the middle, and the people of Judah being the longest part, or that tribal area being the longest part. So I reckon that's pretty cool, particularly here on Good Friday, okay? The people camped around the picture of a cross. Or, if you like, with this military emphasis that we're reading this week, it looked like a picture of a sword from up high. a sword that was going into the promised land. Anyway, that was just free. You can take that or leave it. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so this week, beginning with chapter 7 of Numbers, the trumpets are blown, all right, and we're starting to move on towards the promised land. This is what we've been waiting for. We've been camped at Sinai for a year. We're now finally on the move again. We're marching toward the promised land. Moses is up there at the front going, "Rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered." And things are starting off really, really positive, all right, really, really well. But then all of a sudden, the consequences of their new covenant really begin to kick in. As we remember, before Sinai, in the book of Exodus, they had really bad attitudes. Even though God's rescued them, they whinge, they whine, and they complain, and yet God just continues to bless them. But now, in the book of Numbers, as the trumpets are blown and they start to move on, they behave the same way. They whinge, they whine, and they complain, but now God starts coming out against them. The same behavior results in very different response from God, because they are now in a covenant where if they disobey, God will come out to curse them. And that is what you'll start to see very powerfully this week, which is why you must read these chapters. And the most obvious example is this, is in Numbers 13 and 14, where Moses sends a bunch of spies into Canaan to look at the promised land because they're ready to march in and take hold of the promised land. 10 of them come back with a bad report. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, come back with a good report. And it is in that story where God's people refuse to go in. They say, "We can't do this. We're just grasshoppers," that God curses them and says, "You are not going to enter. This generation will never go in. I'm going to wait a whole nother 40 years for this generation to die out. With the exception of Joshua and Caleb, they can go in." And it is a huge turning point in the story of God's people. What could have taken just a couple of weeks now takes 40 years, because they were in a covenant where they must obey. And if they didn't obey, God would curse them. And this is one of the most obvious examples of that curse that happens in chapters 13 to 14. It's a great story. It's a terrible story, but it's a real poignant story. So please don't miss it, because in the New Testament, it's referred to again and again as something that Christians need to learn from. It's here we intersect Psalm 90, which is a real melancholy type of psalm. It's quite depressing actually, but you can read that for yourself. But it's Moses basically coming to terms with this covenant that they're in, the fact that when they sin, God is going to come out to get them. And then the next thing I want you to really notice is that there is a massive chronological leap in the story around about this time. Don't miss this, okay, because you probably will, okay? After Korah's rebellion, where a leader rises up against Moses, and I could say heaps about that, but I won't. A leader rises up against Moses, and all his family are destroyed. In fact, a plague comes that day with 15,000 people dying. In that one day, God reasserts Aaron as the high priest, okay? I want you to know, Aaron is my chosen man. When we come to chapter 20, they arrive at the desert of Zin where Miriam dies. Moses strikes the rock for water, okay? That chapter has a 40-year gap, or 38-year gap in it. So it starts off, chapter 20 starts by saying, in the first month they came to the desert of Zin. What it means is, as we will find out later in a chronological chapter, I think it's chapter 23 or something, it says in the first month of the 40th year. All right, so that's what it means. So in chapter 20, please take note. This is my job here, is to help you understand the Bible chronologically. There is going to be a massive leap in chapter 20 where all of a sudden Korah rebels, and it's telling a few of the stories of the rebellion in the desert, and then all of a sudden it jumps to 40 years later when Miriam and Aaron, and then of course Moses, dies towards the end there. So please just be aware of that we're going to miss a whole bunch of history, because there's basically essentially a 38-year leap come chapter 20. So I'm going to summarize. There's 5 things I want you to notice this week. The first thing, I want you to look at contrasting God's treatment of them for exactly the same behavior. What they did in the book of Exodus before they came to Sinai and how they behave now is exactly the same, but now God curses them because they're in a covenant that came at Mt Sinai. Number 2, you must please pay attention to the story of the spies, Joshua and Caleb. That is very, very important, that story. Number 3, pay attention to that chronological jump in chapter 20 where decades are skipped just like that, all right, in the storyline. Number 4, I want you to pay attention that the fact that their military battles start to begin. Under Moses' leadership, they start fighting battles before they get to Jericho, before they get to the Promised Land. They start fighting some little battles and start to win them. And number 5, most importantly, Easter weekend, I want you to see Jesus in these chapters, all right? Beginning with Passover, with the water that came out of the rock. Corinthians, Paul says that's a picture of Jesus. With the snake that was put on a pole. There are many pictures in these chapters of Jesus, many shadows of which Jesus is the substance. You're going to enjoy this week. It really is a great story, and really a lot of important things take place. Make sure you find him in the story. Bless you guys. Have a great Easter weekend, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye.